It's offline right now, but it'll go on here in a second. Here we go.
Yeah, that's all right.
And we are live. I have Simon Young with me. Let me get my chat fixed over here.
Hey, Rick.
Yes, sir.
Hello, everyone.
My chat's
If
acting
anyone's
funny.
on the live stream.
All right, Simon Young over in Australia, Yowie hunter.
Yowie enthusiast, I prefer to call myself.
Yeah, we've had a time trying to get this going. I've had to work late. You stayed at work late. Then we got to talking about things, and I think the government popped us off here or something. Crazy.
Dark forces
Yeah.
conspire against us, Rick.
But yeah, I'm showing the picture with the arrow right now. If you want to talk a little bit about yourself, and then
Right.
whatever.
Yeah. So, look, guys, not a problem. Folks, Rick invited me onto the show because he said there's some of you would like to know a little bit more about Yowies. It's I suppose the short, if you really want the short 30-second version of it, they're still Bigfoots over in the States. Probably not the same creature. I'll start from the top. We've got Yowie is a general term that we use for these creatures. Our natives, we call them Indigenous here in Australia, Aboriginals. They prefer to call they call them the hairy man. Depending on what part of Australia from, they've got lots of different names for them, but specifically in my area, we have what they call a dooliga, which are the tall Yowies. The dooliga, I would say, are very much similar to your type. So that's not the Pacific Northwest one. It's the one that's found more in the south and across the country. They're not as tall, a little bit leaner, and not as muscular as a paddy type Bigfoot. But they share the same traits as being more aggressive than the paddy type Bigfoot. So I think your type 2s are known as your more aggressive types over there, and our Yowies probably share a similar temperament. Personally, most of these are my beliefs. What I'm sort of going to say on this chat are my personal beliefs from the observations I've made of doing research for many, many years. I've been doing it over 20 years now. Personally, I think the further north we go in our country, they get more aggressive. I live down here in New South Wales, which is halfway down the eastern seaboard in Australia. I live in Sydney, and my research area is the Blue Mountains, but I do research all outside, and I've been to Queensland to research as well. And I've been south of the country to actually do research in the field. But digressing a little bit, we have another type here we call that our local Indigenous call the Junjadi, or Junjadi, or Junjidi. They've got a couple of different pronunciations for the name. That is a hominid that I think may be linked to something like Homo floresiensis, if you actually do follow those the ancient hominids. And that was Homo floresiensis was a small hominid that was found on the island of Flores in Indonesia about 15 years ago now by some archaeologists or paleontologists, and they were looking around in this cave. They found it. The original carbon dating said it might have been alive as early as 10,000 years ago, but they've since retested it, and they reckon it was this particular specimen they found was probably alive around 40,000 years ago, which also times in with when I think the Aboriginals arrived here. And when we arrived here back, 220 odd years ago, our Indigenous told us that they were not the first settlers of this land. They told us that the hairy man was here before them. So the Junjidi is about 3 to 4 foot tall. It's not a big one. And then in other parts of Australia, I know some other researchers who, I quite trust, and they're do, and one particular researcher said he's even got ones that are like a foot to 18 inches tall. So they're real little people, and what they are, I don't know, and pretty much not going to talk about them today because I don't know anything about them other than they seem to exist and they are out there and people have seen them. But big ones that we call, as I said, we call them the Dooligar. So for today, I'll refer to the big, tall Yowies as the Dooligar, and the smaller ones as Junjidi. So just so you've got that distinction and you know what I'm talking about, because we do research both. I know a lot of people that research Bigfoot sort of dismiss the smaller ones and call them the little people, but they're part of the puzzle, guys. That's what I think anyway. They're part of the puzzle. So what is a Yowie exactly, though? People sort of... Well, actually, before I get into that, I'll tell you what got me interested in this. Go back, I'm sort of 51 years of age now. Go back many, many ago when I was in my late teens into my early 20s. Me and a bunch of mates, we were avid dirt bike riders. Back in the days when you could take an off-road trail bike up into the bush and you could ride around the fire trails for the weekend. We used to spend a lot of time actually camping in the Blue Mountains, and we would drive, say, because we wanted to pretty much party hard, and we were technically riding unregistered bikes. We would go quite deep into the mountains to our campsite, so we didn't get bothered by local police or harassed by anyone, and we just had that happened. There was we used to sit around campfires. All of a sudden a bad smell had something had died, would hang around maybe the camp for an hour and a half, and we'd be like, oh, that smell's still there, and all of a sudden it would disappear, and we'd just sort of pass it off as the wind changing or whatever, even though when you sort of think back, most of those nights the wind was quite still. There was incidences where, we've had things running through the camp and we just put that down when we were asleep in our tents. We heard things go stomping through and we just thought it was either kangaroos or pigs. We do a lot of wild pigs up there. And then there was the throwing and stick throwing. We'd be all sitting around the campfire. We're all drinking, mind you. We were drunk and we were partying on, and we'd have a bit of loud music going and that, and all of a sudden somebody get sort of hit with a pebble and they'd be like, who threw that? And you'd be looking around going, oh yeah, come on, which one of your mates has did that? And you'd sort of, a couple of minutes go by and you come to the realisation that everyone's actually sitting around the fire, and then another little pebble had come rolling along the ground and sort of been thrown from behind you, or a stick had come down and hit someone, and then be like, so then we'd blame it on the possums. And we'd all be looking up in the trees, what was that coming from? And but then there was other times when we actually heard howls and like the whooping and the howling, and we would be sitting there and all of a sudden you would just hear this big whoo, big long, deep whoop coming from maybe a ridge line of, a mile away from you. It was, and they were still quite loud. So whatever it was, an answer coming from another ridge line, which might be, half a mile away from that. And, every Australian kid knew as a term. I mean, Yowies was immortalised in a chocolate bar and an ice cream, where you could buy a Cadbury Yowie chocolate bar and you could buy a Cadbury Yowie ice cream. And so it's not as though people were disputing that they were that we were all aware of what a Yowie was, and we'd even joke with each other and go, oh, it's probably just the Yowies. Sort of, 20-somethings. We didn't really care much. We didn't ever care for a world. I had a couple of incidences where riding through some of the pines. So this area was a lot of what we call, so I suppose it's mid-temperate eucalyptus forest. It's quite tall gums, a lot of ferns around the area. In some of the gullies, it's as I was saying to Rick earlier, it looks very Jurassic Parkish. There's a lot of really tall tree ferns, a lot of underscrub comes up to probably around waist high when you walk through some of it. And that's important because that's actually where I had when like a spot like that, where I had my first sighting. But there was also pine forest. So we were in a state forest, and a lot of the land was cleared, and they'd done pine plantations in there. So there was different areas of the forest which were which had either just been cut, or they were going through regrowth, or they were fully merged, fully 30, 40-year-old radiata pine trees that were going to be cut down and used. They're used in the construction of most of our homes and that in Australia. So there were lots of times when we'd been out riding, and we'd take a water bottle with us and packet of smokes, and you'd stop by the side of the road for you pull up on the track, turn your bike off, sit there, have a drink. And there was a couple of times when I just feeling like we were being watched. Someone had said, I've got an eerie feeling we're being watched right now, and nothing had nothing had happened. There'd been nothing to trigger us to think it. And then a couple of times when, I got a bit of a smell of something that smelt like rotting, decaying garbage mixed with urine and feces and death. It was just sort of that smell mixed up, and you'd get a feeling you were being watched. And this all sort of happened, in my 20s and like in my early 20s, late teens, so sort of 17 through to probably about 23, and we'd had all these experiences. And then the one experience that I still to this day cannot explain was me and a bunch of guys who actually went up there. We took some time off work and we went up there. We'd mainly go up on weekends, and it'd mainly be long weekends, so there'd be other people in the forest when we were there. But if you went up there on a weekday, when there wasn't a long weekend coming up, you would not see anyone in that forest for the whole week. Maybe if they were logging in a particular area near you, you might see some guys in logger trucks from, the forestry workers, but you could be guaranteed you could sit in that camp all week and you would not see a soul. And we'd been in the camp, but we'd camped right down through, so we'd driven right the way through Jenolan State Forest back into Canangra Boyd National Park. You can look that up on map. It's part of the Blue Mountains area there, over in the west of it. And I had a Weber barbecue, and I planned on one of the nights we'd, having the frozen chicken in the esky. By day 4, it had thawed out quite nicely, and I planned to cook it that night. So we put it on the little miniature Weber barbecue, left it there roasting away, and we all jumped on our bikes and went down to the creek for about an hour just for a little bit of a swim and a wash up. Then come back, chicken to be ready and we can all eat. There was only me and 3 other mates. There was 4 of us. And as I said, we hadn't seen anyone in there that whole week. Anyway, we came back to the camp, and I walked straight over to got off my bike, walked over to check how the chicken was going, lifted up the lid on the little mini Weber barbecue, and the chicken was gone. Just gone. No knocked over fire, no nothing. And, my mate said, it was probably a pig. And I said, yeah, pig put the lid back on the Weber. I said a pig would have come and knocked over the fire and, scuttled off with it, probably eaten it right there and left the bones behind. But whatever took that, we saw no car tracks that had been in there, no bike tracks. We'd been riding around that forest all week, and we had covered every single fire trail in that forest that week we were riding. And we had never seen another camper in there. So someone said, one of my mates said, maybe it's just some homeless man that lives out here in the bush and we don't know about it. And we sort of fobbed it off. But anyway, I was reading an article in a newspaper about a lady in the Northern Territory who had her dog's heads ripped off. And she was blaming it on the local Yowies up there. She said that they were howling from up the hill. The dogs were barking at them, and she reckons they came down and the dog went to attack one of them and it picked it up and ripped its head clean off. So we've all heard those stories about Bigfoots doing it. Right. And I was intrigued, and so I started from that point there researching, and I found some very early days of some online and some written stories of people's encounters. And what these people were describing were very, very similar to the smells and the sounds and the feelings of being watched and that. And I thought, and I actually took this sort of information over to my mates that, and the ones who were a little bit more turn around and said, do you reckon it was Yowies that were, in our, harassing us? I said, mate, they could have been sitting there, from what I understand from reading all of this, they could have been sitting there watching us while we're just partying on in the campsite half the time, probably coming in for scraps of food when we've gone to bed. And, maybe the beers that went missing from the eskies weren't Steve-O after all. But it's, and I thought, there's obviously something more to this. So I basically took off up to the Blue Mountains myself, and literally I sort of, didn't really know much, but I went to the areas where we had camped, And I started just walking out. You know, the furthest we'd ever walked away from our camp, bush around it, was probably no more than, you know, maybe 200-300 feet. 100 yards, either to go and do go and do your business in the bush, you know, dig a hole and do your business, or or we were gathering up firewood. But more often than not, when we were gathering up firewood, we'd drive down the fire trails around with just a trailer and load it up, because there was plenty of wood always beside the trails. So I started wandering off, and I coming across. I'd been through a couple of areas, and then the second time I went up there, I'm going to go from our camp down here through this gully and over to what we called the Five Ways intersection. It was just an intersection where 5 trails met at once in one spot. But I sort of had and then I could walk back along the trail, the fire trail, back to where my car was parked and go. So I literally took off walking down the what's the name, and I got to this section where I'm pretty much in the, if you can imagine, you got you're in the bottom of the gully, but it's sloping downhill from you. So you're literally probably maybe 100 metres from the top of the hill down it, but the 2 gullies are coming in either side, and I was smack bang in the middle, and there was a lot of these ferns here, and the ferns were, I was walking through ferns that were probably about just up to my waist or to the top of my thigh. It was quite a windy day. Some of the winds up the mountains there can get pretty hairy. Wind was probably blowing 50 k's an hour, and it was actually blowing straight up the hill. And so it was coming up the gully towards me. So whatever was, they wouldn't have smelt me. And with the wind making the noise, in hindsight, I probably thought the winds actually masked my approach a little bit. And I probably got to a point where within about maybe no more than 20 metres, which is about 22 yards to you guys in the States. And I heard this. I was looking like I was at the bottom of the gully, and I was starting to look up the other side of the gully, heading in the direction I was. And to my left, I heard this like a sort of a gruff sound, if you know what I mean. And I've looked over immediately, and not more than, as I said, about 22 yards away from me, there was quite a tall black. It would have been probably 6 to 7 foot, 6.5 to 7 foot black hominid that was in the process of turning its head away from me and onto all fours. Basically, what I now know is in quadrupedal mode. It dropped down on its front fours, and it took on that mountain at a speed that I have never seen anything like. I wouldn't have even gone down the mountain on a motorbike that fast, because it was just too treacherous, and it just took off. And basically, because of the way the ferns were, all I could see was the back of its head and its shoulders, and bobbing above the ferns as it took off down the mountain. And I, at that point there, literally went, shit, they're real. That was my awakening moment, guys. And that was my very first sighting. And before I joined up with some other guys and who were like-minded people, and we were down in Canangra Boyd National Park again, and reading about Aboriginal folklore of them. But I wish I actually did prior to this event, because that was where we had what was called the 6-foot track. Now, you can look up the 6-foot track. It is a walking, they call it the 6-foot track because on a map it's 6 foot long. It is actually 42-kilometre walking track that pretty much goes from, this is in Sydney's Blue Mountains. You can look it up on Google Earth. Really marked from Explorers Tree down to the very end, almost to Jenolan Caves. And it goes down through the bottom of I think it's the Megalong Valley, across the Cox's River, and then comes back up that into what they call Canangra Boyd National Park on the other side. And I was we actually were walking. We'd probably walked down that track. So we parked our cars near. We'd driven a little bit in the track, probably a couple of kilometres in, and we get to a point where there's like a trailhead. We parked our cars there, and we just started walking on down there. We were about probably 2 kilometres down there, and we got to a bit where there was a gully off to one side, and I said, oh, it was really ferny, and I just said, oh, that looks like a really good Yowie territory down there. And one of the guys said, well, let's go off trail and have a look. So we walked down. We probably walked down this gully, down the hill about 200 metres, and a spot where there was a lot of trees and that pushed up. It was just basically like a blind, and in hindsight now we realise that we probably pretty much walked into the middle of their living room, and within literally as we arrived there, we heard like a bit of a growl, and then a rock came flying over and landed in front of one of my mates. And I said to my mate straight away, I said, we better get out of here like pronto. And we walked straight back up the same way we came back up to the trail, and it had us the whole way up to the main trail. We got onto the main trail, and they were, now if you imagine this, we're now walking uphill and they're on our left. They were every now and then, like their ability to throw a rock through scrub where they can't actually see you but land it pretty much right in front of your feet. And they were hidden and out of sight, but you'd see the rocks coming over. You'd see them launch out of the bush, and you'd be like, look out, another one incoming. And a couple we actually had to dodge. We think a few were aimed our way. But at some point, they actually crossed the trail behind us, and they were now on our right as well. So we actually had them flanking us both from the left and the right. And it looks like, from what I learnt later on, was the Alpha, the Alpha of troops came in on the right with us, and we actually got bluff charged 4 times by that thing. And mates actually ran, but I think the fact that me and the other guy stayed there was probably what stopped them from chasing after him. But he sort of took off. But the alpha male bluff charged us, and he didn't actually expose himself. It sounded like a freight train coming through the bush. You could hear trees crashing and everything breaking. He was roaring and growling, and then he would stop literally probably about 10 metres short of the trail and stay just behind that undergrowth so we couldn't see him. But he'd find a tree to shake the apps. We'd see the tops of these, probably a 30-foot gum tree just shaking violently because he's shaking the crap out of it. Wow. He pushed a couple over on us as well, and it still stands to this day as my moment where I realised what I was doing in this thing. And I've got to warn a lot of people, these things can kill you. Don't let people sugarcoat it. If you do the wrong thing or you upset them the wrong way, they will kill you. Or they'll at very least scare the absolute crap out of you, and they will dispatch you really quick smart. There's 3 incidences of headless bodies being found in the Blue Mountains, where we know that they've had their heads ripped off by Yowies. I think the police know too, but the government know, but no one's going to say anything about it. Anyway, so we literally got marched all the way back to the car. And I did not go back into the woods for probably about 10 years after that. It was a coming to, well, I'm sorry if I offend anyone, but I'm not a religious man, but it was a coming to Jesus moment. It was an oh shit moment, and I really was questioning what I did, because by that stage, I just got married and had started a young family, and I, really want my family to sort of, lose their dad to a Yowie, of all things. And my wife at that time had no idea what I did. She was, as far as she was concerned, I was just going bushwalking, because I didn't even tell her about, our pursuits of Yowies and the people I was going out with. So I was just going camping with mates. And so anyway, I got back into it again after a period of time. And then I met up with Daniel, and, now I'm with actually a really good bunch of blokes. But the funny thing, what I said about, I wish I'd read some stuff about the Indigenous information about that area, was the Aboriginals have said that in their folklore, they always said that the Yowies or the Dulaga of Canangra Boyd were man-eaters, and were not to be trusted at any point. But they had other Yowie tribes that were in the Blue Mountains that they knew of, that they did actually trust, and they traded with, and they had a mutual respect with as well. The Junjadee, though, not so much. The Junjadee to them are real little craps, but we'll talk about that later. They're the nasty ones. The Junjidi were the ones that stole their babies and stole their women, and there's plenty of indigenous legends of, Junjidi dragging 4 or 5 Junjidi dragging a fully grown man off into the bush and eating him.
Wow.
So
is it
sparked my interest in where
with the arrow, is that the, what do you call them, a Dunger D?
the Junjidi. It's spelled Junjadee, Junjadi.
Okay.
So like Jumanji, but Junjadi.
Right.
But so the Junjidi, I'll talk more about them a little bit later. But I really to it, and some of those early days, and then sort of got me to realise that it's it's a dangerous thing, but the call was always there. It was always, I want to get out and find the answers. I want to get out and find what these creatures are. And I do, and as I said to you earlier, Rick, I do this because all I want out of all of this is the government to actually say they're real, and I want them to give some people some advice on how to protect themselves from these things, because they, if you're in a situation, happen to stumble across a troop or even an individual, and you do the wrong thing, you could find yourself in very serious trouble. And what I mean by do the wrong thing, it could be even something simple as turning and running away or screaming like you're scared, because like any predator, I think when you do that, you can set off that predate mode in them. However, if you run into a pack of Junjidi, I highly advise that you get the friggin' hell out of there as quick as you can, because they are nasty, nasty people. Or nasty, well, actually, they could be people, who knows. Anyway. So the current group I'm with, I basically research with a bunch of guys in the Blue Mountains. We've got our Blue Mountains research page. Some of you guys know us through the Yowie Times. So Daniel Raymond, the editor of the Yowie Times. Dan's an awesome guy. I met Dan a few years back and started, through the. So we've got this. We had these forums called the Australian Yowie Hunters Forums, or what we call AYR as well. So if you look for Australian Yowie Research or yowiehunters.com, I think it is, a page that has lots of actual eyewitness accounts up there. He's got a couple of thousand up there now from memory. He spent quite a bit of time. This is Dean Harrison's group website, and Dean spent a bit of time actually getting a lot of those actually put onto YouTube. He's actually contacted some of the people who did the sightings as well. He's got them talking in eyewitness reports, similar to what some of the guys do in the States. So there's a great body of eyewitness reports if people want to go there and listen to those. And they're very short, they're very digestible. There's one thing I do like about it is, unlike some others that wanted you to sit through an hour or 2 hour long episode, people talking about stuff. Now, Rick, and I'm not having a go at you when I say that, but these are easily digestible, short, 5-10 minute people just describing their encounter. Dean's very matter of fact. His interview style's just very straight to the point, and he just gets the information out of them, does the thing. But it's good information because a lot of it's very, very similar. And we see a new report come up on Dean's website, and the first thing we do is schedule a visit to the area at the nearest possible weekend we've got to go and check it out. And especially if it's a new area where we know, where we've never had reports from, we're like, all right, let's go and see if there's any evidence out there. And more often than not, we go out there and we can actually see, we'll find some tree breaks, we'll find some bends, and we'll find evidence of them being in the area. So, it's a corroborate that, because then you think, all right, well, this is a person who's never seen one, describes something to a T what we know it is, and then we go out there and find evidence what we know what we're looking for, and we can sort of say, all right, well, they're definitely in the area. So I met Dan through those forums that we have on that group, and you can join the forums. There's a bunch of guys up there that are they're all nice people. No one really. I mean, no one. Australians are a little bit different to guys in the States. We don't seem to have as many trolls in out here as you do over there, and which is disappointing. You guys have those trolls, but there's plenty of people out there that personally I know have probably never gone into the bloody bush, yet they've all got an opinion on Bigfoot is real, and they all want to call people out for this and that. But we don't have a lot of that in Australia. The guys on the forums are pretty good guys, and feel free to join the forums. Dean might take a week to actually approve you on the forums because he's a busy man, and the discussions up there. But you can actually read a lot of the discussions on the forums without being a member. And as I said, that's where I met Dan when he sort of put a recruitment thing up there, and we used to start organising we started organising some research weekends up there and to try and find like-minded people. But in the end, Dan's formed on Facebook. So we've got the Yowie Times group, which is our public site for the newsletter and for people that want to know more information about it. So just go to Facebook and search for the Yowie Times. I think Rick's provided the link. But we've also got a closed group, which is just us researchers, and please don't ask me to link you to that. There's that is basically by invitation only. Don't ask me. I'm talking your listeners, Rick. It's a group that we just talk about. We actually organise specific weekend researches, and we're very detailed in what we're doing. And the reason why we keep it a closed group is we don't want members of the public finding out about our weekends and then possibly going in there and trying to put false evidence out there for us, or go and hide in the bushes and make whooping sounds and things like that because they know we're going into a particular area. When we do go into an area, funny thing though is, we go in. There's a photo of I think I sent you a photo there, Rick, of there. That's me. I'm the photo up, and I'll tell you who's who in the zoo on that. That's me, Adam, and Dan. That's us just before we went on to a Yowie research night down in Wedderburn, which is just south of Sydney. But Adam and Dan is, as you can see, we've got a lot of gear on us, and Adam we call MacGyver because Adam literally, he's also right into, bug out bags and things like that. And Adam wears a full tactical vest. And trust me, if anything goes wrong, Adam's usually got something on that tactical vest to fix it when we're out in the bush. So it's great to have along, but the problem is you arrive there and half an hour later, we're all sitting there, we're probably on our second beer or a bottle of water and on our 10th cigarette because we're waiting for Adam to get his shit together. But lovely bloke, and we'll go out there and Adam, and people see us walk into the bush and they're like, what are you here? We're like, wildlife research. Because in the past we've turned around, walked into campsites. We had one where we walked in there and people said, what are you guys doing here? We said, actually we're from Blue Mountains Yowie Research Group. We're down here doing some Yowie research. And they packed up their tents and left. And it's like, yes, plan worked. The area's ours for the night. So we have been a bit cheeky with that, but I really don't care people's opinion of me. If I walk in and they go, yeah, Yowies, you're off your rocker. There's no such thing as Yowies. I'll turn around and go, mate, believe whatever you want to believe. It doesn't faze me because I know what's out there. I've seen them. People say, do you believe in them? I go, no, I know they're there. I've had quite a few close encounters, and even to probably my most recent encounter was we had we went for a Yowie research night. Now I showed you that I've sent you that photo of that map there too, Rick. You can put that up for your listeners to have a look at. That's a place called Sassafras Gully in the Blue Mountains. It's just literally you just go to Wentworth Falls and you can walk down a trail, probably about, I think it's about 1.9 kilometres from the top of the trail, so just over a mile, but it's pretty rugged. You head down you drop down about 900 feet down to the bottom of the gully, but you end in what looks like it's a magical little fairyland. There's sort of little waterfalls and that through the creek. There's moss covering all the rocks. It's a little bit very rainforesty, very moist. There's overhangs, there's glowworms, real spooky sort of area, especially at night. And we've had quite a few interactions with Yowies down there. We had one night, got some really great recordings of us sitting there one night. We were literally listening to 4 Yowies walking through the bush, and we could hear them cracking open logs and then and basically scourging for bugs and that, which is what they do. They'll actually even take big bites out of the side of trees here. So that's one thing I think they do very different to yours. Is ours do seem to eat a lot of bugs, but they'll literally just go and rip open a tree to get them or take a big bite out of them. Gang cockatoos do it as well, but you can always tell the difference between a bird doing it because they more rip away strips of it, where a Yowie will just take a massive big bite out. And usually when a gang's been doing it, there's a lot of bird shit on the ground right near it. because, they drop their droppings, but a yowie will just take the bite out, get its borer or whatever it's after. How it knows it's in the tree, I don't know, whether they can smell it or whatever. But we were listening to them do that, and then it got to a point where we were on one side of a creek and they actually started to come down the creek, and then we pretty much summed the situation up straight away when one growled at us that they actually wanted to cross the creek and we were on the other side. So we backed about 50 metres back down the trail, and one by one, them on the parabolic, splash down in the creek, cross the creek, and then walk up the mountain up the other side. And I said to the boys when they'd gone through, when we walked back to the one camp, and what had happened on that night, Dan had sort of he'd said that we were camping at the Victory campground. So me and the guys that went in early Saturday morning, we went to the Victory campground, but what he actually meant was another campground, which was down the Victoria Trail. So there was a little bit of confusion, and we ended up camping probably about 2.5 to 3 miles apart from each other. So it was not long a walk between the two campsites. So we went back to Dan's campsite, and I said to the boys that were at my campsite, I said, what's on the other side of that mountain, don't you, that they were heading up? And they went, no, I haven't looked on the map to see that entirely. I said, well, if they come down the other side, that's straight into our campsite. So we went back there at about 1 o'clock in the morning, back to our campsite, and we just the guys that I'd come with, they were younger fellas, and they brought a little esky of beers down into the forest and we had a quick beer each, and pretty much straight off to sleep, because we'd already had a fair bit of activity for the night. But as soon as we turned those torches out, mate, and we're in our tents, I hear Greg sort of go, "Hey, can you hear that?" And I'm like, "No," and he's going, "There's someone walking around up in the hill behind my tent." So I'm in my tent, I've got my thermal in there, I've got my parabolic mic in there. So I'm literally, and because it was, we're talking the 1st of February, it was, I still think the temperature that night only dropped down to 23 degrees Celsius. So that's quite a warm night. And I was in my tent sleeping on top of a ground sheet. It was a little 2-man dome tent. I didn't close the screen on it. I just had the fly screen shut to keep the bugs out, so I could sort of see and hear quite out of the tent. And of course, I put my parabolic up, and straight away I could hear through the parabolic these things. And then literally a minute later, I could hear some other footsteps coming from over my left. And I'm like, shit, dude, they're over on our left now. And then I heard some coming from behind us as well as I'm swinging the parabolic around. And so there were literally 3 footsteps. And I said, they think they're surrounding us. And they were just moving around. They weren't getting closer, and we were buggered because I had walked that day. And now, by the time I got out of there, I'd done 23 kilometres up and down mountains in less than a 24-hour period. And I'm not, I'm an overweight, bloody middle-aged man. I'm not a super fit guy, so that was a bit of hard work for me. And I drifted off to sleep. And I remember waking up around 2 in the morning, about an hour later, because I think I went to roll over and I still had the headphones on and I still had my parabolic in my hand. And I'm like, I sort of pulled them off, put them down, and I went back to sleep. And then at about 4 a.m, I got woken up by the loudest sniffing. And when you sort of wake up sometimes, Rick, and something startles you when you sleep, and it takes you a few seconds to realise what's going on and where you are, and I'm like, woke up, I went, is that a horse or a cow or something like that? And then I realised, sort of the realisation hit where I was, what I was doing, and I'm like, oh shit.
Oh, it's a yowie.
And what had literally happened is I'm in a 2-man dome tent, so my head's right up one end, my feet touch down the other because I'm 6 foot tall, and it's literally on the other side of that thin little bit of nylon, probably about 2 feet away, and it had stooped right down low. It was probably only 2 or 3 feet off the ground, and sitting there, and it took 4 big audible sniffs. And I'm like sitting there going, is it sizing me up to eat me, or is it, wondering if I'm tasting? Is it wondering what I smell like, or is it looking for something, and is it in my tent? And sort of all these thoughts are going through my head because that's the closest. And people go, how do you know it was a yowie? Well, when you hear the next part, you'll understand why. But I was literally petrified and I froze. People go, why didn't you get your thermal out? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you take a photo? It's like when you're in that situation and one's right on you and you realise what it is, you don't do it. And anyway, this thing literally stepped out and like walked from the side of my tent right in front of where I could see out the front, and there was enough light there. I clearly saw The first leg just literally stepped past the tent
Oh.
to almost level with the end of the tent. And there it's and I could not see, like I could see right up to the top of my fly on my dome tent, and I could not see where those legs met in a crotch.
Oh my goodness.
And I could see they were dark, I could see they were hairy. And then he took another step and another couple more steps. And then Greg in the other tent, I heard him stir, and he's like, oh, like groaned and rolled. You could hear his sleeping bag rustling and that. And whatever this thing was just took off, and it was like boom, 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 big, loud thuds. And, you know, I could feel the thuds. Like I felt his footsteps when he walked past, even when he was walking quietly. I could feel every time he put his foot down, I felt it in the ground. But when he ran, it literally was almost like a pack of bloody, you know, a horse gallop. It's like when if you've ever been to the races and they're coming down the main straight, and you can feel that the 24 racehorses all brum, brum, brum. You could feel that through the ground like you could at the racetrack as he ran off. And I pretty much sat there in fear. And, we talked a little bit earlier before we had this thing about the chattering and the communications they do. Well, ours do very good impersonations of native birds, like yours do good impersonations of your owls and that. And pretty much I got out of my tent, stayed awake for the rest of the night. At about 5:45, it was first light, and there was enough light up there that I thought I can get up now. I unzipped my tent, I stood up and stood up the front, and as I immediately stood up, probably about 100 yards down one end of the gully, I heard whoop, 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 and another 100 yards up the other end of the gully, and from both points they would have had a visual of where I was. I've heard a whoop, 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 whoop reply, 4 whoops, and I know they weren't birds because the whoops were too deep and whatever. And I actually at that point there, because I've been woken up and I'd hardly had any sleep, I was a little bit cranky, and I've just yelled out, "Yeah, I'm effing up, all right. Now you can go back to doing what you're doing." And I yelled that out, and of course Greg and Scott in the other tent, they didn't even hear me get up, and they probably woke up about another half an hour later. And when Greg got up, the first thing he said to me, he goes, "Did you hear that thing run through the camp last night?" Before I even said anything to him about my experiences, and that when I knew straight away, then I went, "Yep, that definitely happened. It wasn't me having a dream." Because sometimes you think you're having a dream and that, but when your mate who, just gets up and the first thing he says to you is, "Did you hear that thing run through the camp last night?" And I said, "Boys, haven't I got a story to tell you?" So, and they were actually really pissed off that they'd missed it.
Was any of your group a snorer?
Actually, yeah, I think I did hear Scott. Scott was the first one to fall asleep, and Scott was not so much a snorer, but more of a breather like that, if you know what I mean. That kind of noise. He was making those noises, but I'm a snorer myself. I'm a snorer, so that's why he could have been up to me for sure. And if I'm lying flat on my back, I will snore. So maybe that's why he was interested in me. But that was sort of.
I'm a firm believer that snoring is the best booger call out there. They know you're asleep.
Maybe it is.
Remember what I was telling you before we went live? Yeah.
Yep.
They know you're asleep.
Maybe it very well is. And it's funny how he was at my tent and not the other guy's tent. So, yeah, I could have been doing my usual snoring. I mean, if anyone wants to know I'm a snorer, just ask my wife.
She'll tell you. I've got a recording of my buddy snoring, all right, that's what I'm going to try whenever I go camping, is just to play the recording and see if they come in.
Sound blast snoring.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I talked to, the guys with the Beast, Mark and Larry, the Beast team.
Yep.
Yeah, we've talked about it too, because they've got a recording here recently where I think Mark fell asleep and Larry got up with a FLIR and recorded some stuff going on around their camp. Yeah.
Well, that wouldn't surprise me because, I don't know the guys, but I've seen photos of them and they're all very similar build to me. We're all middle-aged, overweight men. So, yep, chances are we're all bloody snorers. That I wouldn't put it past them. So,
right.
And I mean no disrespect, Larry and Mark, calling you middle-aged, overweight men. Or actually, Mark's not that overweight, but I think Larry's a bit of a solid unit. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, well,
and I think from the photos I've seen of you, Rick, you got a little bit of girth around your middle too, haven't you?
Oh yeah. I've lost about 30 pounds since starting this boogering. like last year,
Well,
sitting around this winter,
walking up and down all the
killing
hollers
me.
over there, you will.
Yeah, yeah, walking up and down these hills, good exercise.
Yeah,
But
so look, that's sort of what I do. So I'll go back to now. I'll talk a little bit more about the Junjidi. Now that photo was that photo you first posted up. The Junjidi are the first thing I've got to say about these guys. They are extremely elusive. It is like, as I said, I have seen in all my years doing it, I have seen a half a face of a Junjidi, and that is that half a face you can see in that photo. And that particular Junjidi was caught in by Adam, where we'd set a camera trap up, and then we were going back to retrieve it, and literally they walked down to the rock, and I think being a grey one, he was probably an older one. With the hair had gone a little bit grey. I think like us, they get a lot of white hairs through their hair, and they get a little bit greyer as they get older. I'm not talking about the Dooliga now. I'm talking about the Junjidi. I actually personally have not seen or heard of white and grey Dooligas, but there very well may be. They're the big guys, remember everyone, the Dooliga. But they're more brown, everything from black through to a dark brown to a reddish brown to almost an auburn colour. And I think they very much adapt to the forest they live in. You know, if they're the ones that have been seen in the pine forest, which where the pine forest might be green, a lot of the needles on the ground in Australia get very red because the pine forests are very, very dense. They're plantation pines, and I think their hair just naturally grows red to blend in with the background around them. I think they may even have that ability to do it similar to pigs. You know how you can release a domesticated pig into the wild, and after about 6 months, it'll actually grow dark hair and start to go dark, and it'll lose its pinkish colour. I think they can do that, and it can adapt to its surroundings of where it's living, and so the Junjidi guy, he was basically caught under a log. So there was like a den, we call it the Junjidi den, and they dug out right under a log, and we found a couple of hair samples in there. Unfortunately, there was nothing of any decent to get any DNA off. We did send them off to a person we know that does that type of analysis, and they said, look, no, they're unsuitable. But you could see where clearly something had been living, and you could see a path where it was going out, and the trail cam was placed on that. And as I was talking earlier, these things can move really, really fast. And I think when Dan opened up the trail cam and looked at it and said there was 450 videos this thing had taken in a 2-week period, which is more like the camera was full, and we'd never had that camera going and picking it up. And there was just blurs on it. Everything was just these black flash blurs coming out of this den. So whatever moving it out of that den, they moved in out there quick. But we knew this one was there. You could literally see it, and Adam trained a video on it. And for a good 20 minutes, we were standing on this rock looking at it, waiting for this thing. And only twice in that 20-minute period, he actually popped his head out enough to see half his face. And Adam got that still that you've got there off that video later on. And as soon as we had to get down from the rock to walk around to where it was, he took off into the wild. He took off, literally. You heard him running off through the scrub. I've been back to that area again quite a few times. It's not far from houses, mate. It's literally only probably about 500 metres down a hill from a whole bunch of houses. And I've been down in there. I found some bedding areas where a whole heap of ferns and everything has been completely flattened out, and something's been in there, and you can see little piles of nutshells and things like that where they've been sitting in there and eating, and that. So it's definitely a very active area. But that image of the Junjidi is the only image I have seen of a Junjidi in all of the stuff I've seen in Australia. And I know it's only one eye, one and a half eyes, a nose, and probably 3/4 of a mouth. But if you look on that image, on that photo, and can blow it up and look right above that arrow, you'll see his little grey face there just sticking out from behind that log. I don't know. Did you see what I was talking about, Rick? You've got the image there on a bigger screen. Can you see what I'm talking about?
yeah, I see what you're talking about. And also, there's like a 2-minute delay between the video and whenever you're talking. So in case you.
Oh, that's all right. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So people, you should be able to see that, and it's they're that elusive, guys. There's only one other video of a Junjidi that I've seen captured, and that was captured on a very, very grainy old mobile phone camera. The story behind it, there was a bunch of Indigenous boys out in the, I think it was out in the Pilliga. They'd been fishing in a river. They had there were two utes, and there were some boys, what we call utes, you call them pickups over there. So they were in pickups. They were sitting in the back tray of a pickup with their backs up against the back wall and the glass, and he's filming his mate behind him in the other pickup truck. And so it's a really early model mobile phone camera. The image is really poor, but you just see this black flash at this point. You see this black flash come out from the bush at the side. It jumps up onto the side of the pickup, on the tray of the pickup, throws itself into the pickup, and basically it stole some fish and jumped out the other side of the pickup and ran off into the bush. Now, the Junjidi are, as I said, by some tribes, they are revered as a very, very nasty little piece of work. And some tribes actually also see them as an omen of death. This particular boy that filmed it, he was that distraught that he thought when I say omen of death, they think they are going to die a very violent death if they have had an encounter with a Junjidi. Not at the hands of the Junjidi, but doing something else. And this young fella basically took his own life about 4 days. The story behind it is he took his own life about 4 days after it, but because he thought he was actually going to die a horrible death. So, maybe the philosophy rung true in him taking his own life, but I don't know. But if you want to see that video, go to YouTube, search for a channel called The Rusty 222, and look for a video of his that's called The Devil. That is another name. In some tribes, the word Junjidi or Junjadi translates into devil. So some tribes said they're just a very cheeky, not to be trusted one that steals wives and eats babies, or steals your babies and your wives and will eat people. They call them the cannibals. Other tribes actually consider them a far more sinister omen of really bad things to come. So that's really all I know about the Junjidi. They're very, when you hear them, we've walked into areas and we know they're in there, because it's like when you see those David Attenborough movies when the chimps are on a hunt and you hear them all screaming and like whooping and yahooing and and you hear them chimping away. That's what they sound like when a Junjidi troop's on the move, and you come into the area, because they pretty much will scarper and run away. And they do it when you get within, maybe 100, 150 metres of where they are. They don't wait till you're almost upon them to get out of there. But they make, in a lot of instances, to warn the troop, they can make a lot of noise in doing it. And I actually think their troops are actually quite large in numbers, purely based on the vocals that you hear. When you hear them all running away, you think, God, there must be bloody 20 of the buggers. There's always a lot of noise, but they're only in certain pockets. I don't think there's a lot of them up in the far north of the country. We seem to have a lot up in the Blue Mountains, and a lot up and down that Great Dividing Range. So if you have a look at a map of Australia, if people say you want to come to Australia and look for Yowies, well, where do I start? Get a map out, look over the east coast of Australia, and you've got this thing that runs pretty much from the far north of Queensland all the way down through the country, just off the coast, right the way down through New South Wales, comes into what we call our Australian Alps, and then down into Victoria. But that whole range is a mountain range called the Great Dividing Range. And pretty much anywhere along that Great Dividing Range, you can find Yowies. Everywhere I've ever gone and looked along there, every Yowie hunt I've ever been on, we found some type of evidence of them being in an area. They may not have specifically been in that area at any time, but we have found breaks, bends, that we look at them, they've got twists in the breaks. They're not natural. The bends we found, incidentally, that Junjidi den where we found a tree bend there where a beautiful sapling, probably 20 foot high, was bent right over. It was held down where it was still alive. It was held down one end with a log, just very similar to what you do. And when you stood at that, like in the middle of that arch, and looked back towards their den, we counted 14 game trails, but they weren't game trails. These were the trails that these guys were making, all emanating out from that one point and going off in different directions down the mountain. And we found, spots on the like the moss on the rocks where they're constantly been going up, and they'd worn the moss down off the rocks, where there's moss either side, but where they've been putting their feet, the moss had just been pushed off. And these aren't roos. This area is a little, probably those sort of, roos. Kangaroos don't. The wallabies can do a little bit of rock hopping, but these were not. We didn't see kangaroo prints. We could see prints that were very, very similar to small child's feet. That's the type of prints you see, or indentations are like a smaller child's foot that are pushing these off. So, they're out there, the Junjidi. I would be very wary if you ever encountered them. One more thing I will tell you about, and these sort of things sum it up for me. We know there's some Junjidi down in Glenbrook, in the Blue Mountains. So Glenbrook's just one other suburb. There is also a place in Glenbrook called the Monkey Trail. And people often ask why it's called the Monkey Trail. Well, we were on a Yowie hunt, or Yowie research weekend over the far side of the mountains. We were actually over in Jenolan and Hampton State Forests, and once again, you can look these up on the map there. And we'd gone for dinner down at the pub. There's a place called the Hampton Halfway Roadhouse. It's like a gas station, general store and pub and cafe and restaurant all in one thing. So we'd gone down there for a feed that night. Usually if we're doing a one night thing, we won't take a lot of stuff camping because we prefer to go out late. We will actually, like later into as a Sony Rick, we sort of start researching sometimes 10, 11 o'clock at night into the wee hours of the morning. We decided to go down to the pub and have a steak for dinner. And met some Chinese tourists there, and I talked to a lot of people, and they saw my I was actually wearing a Bigfoot Outlaws t-shirt at the time, and they saw the Bigfoot logo, and I could see them staring at it, funny, but they smiled, and I walked up and I said, "Oh, you guys tourists, are you?" And they went, "Yeah," and they spoke quite good English. I said, "Are you from China?" And they went, "Oh, no, we've moved to Australia. We live in Sydney, but this is our first trip to the Blue Mountains." And I said, "Oh, how long have you been living in Sydney?" And they've been there for 3 years. The husband and the wife both they're actually from Hong Kong, so that probably explained why they spoke reasonably good English. I said to them, I said, "So where have you been today?" And they said, "Oh, well, we went down to what's the name, and this morning we walked along the Monkey Trail down in I said, "Oh, down near Glenbrook," and they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Oh, what was that like?" And they said, "Well, we heard the monkeys, but we didn't see any." Really? And so I turned around and I said, "Did you know that?" And you can check this, on Google and whatever. But did you know that there's no scientists in Australia have actually said that there are no monkeys that live in Australia? As a matter of fact, there's no primates that live in Australia. And they went, "Well, what did we hear?" And I said, "You're from China, right?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Have you ever heard of the Yeren?" And their faces went white. Now, I don't know if you guys know about the Yeren, but the Chinese 2 years ago actually declared the Yeren as a real and existing species.
Right. Ain't that
They've
amazing?
said, yes, it exists. Yeah, they've said, and the Asian countries are completely different. You look in Bhutan, they call their version of the Yeti the Migloi or the Mogloi or something like that, or the Mogoli. It's a Migoli or something like that. They've got a funny name for it, but Bhutan has set aside a 274,000 square kilometre wilderness area as a sanctuary for the Bhutan and a particular type of panda. Sorry, for the Mogloi and the what's the name, and they actually recognise it as a national species there as well. So they firmly believe these things are real. But yeah, I said to these people, I said, and their faces went white, and I said, "Well, it's not actually like a Yeren." I said, it's a lot smaller, about 3 or 4 foot high, like a chimpanzee." They said, "So they're not monkeys?" I said, "Not according to our scientists." Somehow I don't think they'll be going for a walk along the Monkey Trail again, but yeah, it was those sort of things to me when you got people, from China. Now, Asians know monkeys, right? They know monkeys because they've grown up and they lived around and they know what they sound like.
Right.
Australians, we don't know shit about monkeys. Sorry for swearing, people, but we do not know anything about monkeys. We don't have primates here. So when a person from Asia turns around and says they walked in my Blue Mountains and they said they heard monkeys, that is just another piece of evidence to me that says, yep, they're definitely out there. You know, you can't dispute that sort of experience from a person. So, you know, I challenge any person here now, if they weren't hearing monkeys, which they know what they sound like, what were they hearing?
Exactly.
You know, no one can seem to answer that question. And they're the sort of things that when you hear that, and when you hear people that, you know, I love the sightings when people that don't even know what a Yowie was and they've had to go online and look it up. You know, they start looking it up and they find out about Yowies for the first time because they're trying to find answers to something they've seen that doesn't make sense. They've seen a tall, hairy thing standing by the side of a road or crossing a road in front of them, and they're at a loss because our government's let them down and hasn't told them they're there. You know.
Yeah.
People don't talk about it, and people, the problem with Australia is, like, you go and look at, there's a great book, if people want to read and learn about the Yowie, go and buy the Yowie by Paul Cropper and Tony Sheldon, okay? It's a book, you can get it on, from, I think, Zootopia Books. It's not available on what is it, Amazon, and I'm not plugging these guys' books. I bought a copy of it myself just to read, but the one thing I like about it is they start off talking about when Australians first came to Australia and we started spreading out from Sydney, the amount of encounters with hairy men, or what they called yahoos, the amount of newspaper clippings and old articles where they talk about these things are absolutely phenomenal. And then for some reason around about 1913, so we're talking probably late 1700s, definitely early 1800s, because we came here in 1788, all right, to Australia. And that's when we first settled. So we had our bicentenary in 1988. And we pretty much stayed in Sydney for a bit, and then we started to spread out. And as we spread out into places outside of Sydney called Goulburn, we spread up into the Blue Mountains. They found the trail over the Blue Mountains because by that time they actually thought there was an inland sea on the other side of the Blue Mountains, the early settlers. But when we spread out, we were having encounters with these things everywhere. There is a suburb just south of part of the Sydney metropolitan area, and it's right on what's called the Port Hacking River. People can go and look up this, and it's called Yowie Bay. Wonder why that's called Yowie Bay, you know?
Right.
But that is, and there were bush rangers in there that had encounters. Like, you know, bush rangers, our bush rangers was your version of, what do you call it, Jesse James, Bush Cassidy and the Sundance Kid? Well, we called them bush rangers out here. And, you know, we had Captain Thunderbolt, or Captain Thunderbolt, was it? I think his name was. And there was Ben Hall, and of course Ned Kelly was our most famous bushranger. But a lot of the early bushrangers had sightings with these hairy men because they were living on the outskirts of Sydney, hiding in their little camps in the bush. And they were always listening out because the troops would go off and, you know, in search of these bushrangers and basically try and find them, and, you know, they usually end up with a bullet in their back, or they get arrested and dragged back, you know, back in and put in jail. But the bushrangers have even had encounters with them as well. So, but by 1913, from 1913 to pretty much 1974, there was not a mention in a newspaper article or anything about any Yowie sightings, any Yahoo sightings, any hairy men sightings. It just seemed to disappear off the face of the earth. And it's only just recently that people have started getting more back into it, and people are now coming out of the woodwork and, you know, with some absolutely amazing stories. I read one story of a guy who was a 90-year-old guy who lived up in Grafton. They lived on a farm. They were surrounded by bush, and he even talks about memories of when he was a kid of the Yowies coming and stealing fruit, like not stealing, but they would actually come into their house, open up the back door, walk in, take fruit from the fruit bowl. He said, I can remember playing with the Yowie kids in the backyard while their parents sat on the edge of the forest and watched us, and my parents sat on the porch and watched us. And they seemed to have a little bit of a symbiont relationship. And he said, we lived in harmony with them. We didn't bother each other, but nobody took rifles to them and stuff like that. So you hear all of these stories coming out now as people talk about it more. And I think that's what it is people have come out and said, actually, these things are real. People are not going to sit there and they want to get their story out before they die because they've been sitting on something that was so amazing for years, but they were too afraid to say anything to anybody because they thought they were going to be called a crazy nut.
Right.
So, yeah, that's so I've got off on a little bit of a tangent there, but yeah, so that is, I suppose, you know, I don't know what more. Have you got any questions from you? Is anyone online actually listening, or that they've asked any questions about it they want to ask?
Yeah, I'm doing a lot of buffering. Let me play this video that you sent me, and then I'll close
Oh
it
yeah.
out. See
So
if that.
before you play the video, do you want me to give a description of what it is, or do you want to play it and then I'll talk after it?
Yeah, let me play it first so I can close that window out. Maybe that'll help with the
Yep.
buffering. I'm not sure what's going on with it.
Okay.
I think this is a great video. I would love to get video like this.
Yeah. Well, that video. Can I talk while it's playing, or do you want me to be quiet?
Yeah, it's playing now.
Yeah.
That video, folks. There's no audio on that, I don't think, and if it is, it's not much. But that video was basically. My friend Daniel, who made that video, who took that video, he's actually just we found out why his arm was sore. He got a spider bite on his arm, so he's just let everyone know the Yowie Times is nearly finished, and his arm's a lot better now. So he's probably waiting on my article, to be honest.
Yeah.
But yeah. Anyway, that video of Dan's basically and this shows you, you know, that is probably and plenty. We've shown that to plenty of people, and a lot of people have said privately it's the best video they've seen come out of Australia, because there are some other ones there that are very questionable. But that video was purely taken by accident, guys, and it shows you how lucky you can get.
Right, it's
Dan
amazing.
was looking at Dan was looking at a tree break, and he actually put his camera down on a rock, and in putting his camera down on the rock, he got 6 frames of that thing walking around the ledge. And basically, there was another gentleman with him that heard like the thud and looked up, and he saw the flashes that went around there. And he said to Dan, he said, I think there was a Yowie there, but Dan didn't see that. And Dan went home that night and watched the video back, played the video back on a big screen, and saw that they'd captured 6 frames of it. But if you look very carefully in that big rock there, and some of the commentary there, because Heath from our group went back up there with his boys a couple of weeks later, and they walked right up to the rock where Dan saw it, or where it is on the video there, and that rock was 12 foot high off the ground. So we estimate that thing was at least 10 foot tall, and it literally had jumped down to that point. The guy that did see it reckons it had a rue in his shoulder, and some of the people that have seen the video said, yeah, it looks like it had something on his shoulder. I think some people have tried to enhance it a little bit. I must say, Dan kept that video private for 3 years. He's only just put that up on YouTube when we started the Australian Yowie channel, because in getting to know me a bit, I sort of, you know, convinced him that, you know, he's a smart guy. He's got some good ideas and he's done some good research, and it's time to maybe get out and show the world a little bit out what Aussies can do without all the bullshit behind it, if you know what I mean. It's because we do have some guys out here who've got, you know, some channels that are very prolific in the amount of videos they put out, but most of their stuff is, you know, you can see them walking through the bush, and every time they hear a leaf drop, oh, it's a Yowie. You know, or they hear a crack of a branch, it's a Yowie, or they'll hear a noise and they'll go, it's a Yowie, you know, and we don't buy into that garbage, mate. You know, and there's another guy who's putting out an awful lot of videos, but I've got some grave reservations about the safety of his family, because he's basically, it started off as accidental habituation. I think they bought the property and they didn't realise it was a pre-habituation site, and they've been pestered by these Yowies, and of course now he's going down and trying to film them in the bush. You know, started up his YouTube channel. I think it's all great, but there's a point where, as you and I both know, where things are going to turn, and you're very wary of that. You know, you've now got them visiting your home, Rick, primarily, and I think you've even publicly said this, because you've gone down and visited them in their home.
Yeah, I think a lot of the times whenever I go looking, they come here.
Yeah, they do, and and I always say, once they know that they're real, the whole game changes.
Oh, it's game on.
And that's when you've got to start to being real careful with what you're doing, because I firmly believe these things, that when they think you don't know what they are, they love screwing around with you.
Right.
They'll throw the little pebbles at you. They'll make their noises. They'll make their breaks. They love watching people. I think they love making people look like they're at a tennis match, that their head's flinging from one side to the other all the time.
Yeah.
Reacting to all the sounds around them. But when push comes to shove, once they know that they're real, the whole game changes, and that's when they stop playing the games and they get a little bit more serious with you. And if you put the wrong foot out of place, that's when you can be in some real serious trouble. That's, as I said, that's my opinion. Others might differ from that, but I think that's where some people are going. We've been into areas like there's places up in the Blue Mountains where people have been doing accidental habituation by leaving out pet foods, by having fruit trees in their backyards. There's one street up there where everyone's dog bowls were going missing, and there's a guy up there, Neil Frost. Now, Neil came out, he was a school teacher, he came out, talked about basically a group of Yowies, a group of Dooliga that were on his property, and he lives in the Blue Mountains, has lived up there for 20-odd years. And Neil won't talk to anyone now because he's been ridiculed, but Neil has got some amazing stories of, these things coming up and literally, tapping on his windows, pinching things from there. But a lot of people in his street had their dog bowls missing. And one day Neil was walking his dog down the bush trail, and he was just sort of coming back up the trail, and it was a point where he already walked past down into the bush. And then when he came back up, there, right beside a gum tree, right on the side of the trail, were 12 neatly stacked dog bowls. Some plastic, some metal, and they were all like they were put there for him to find. So he grabbed the pile of dog bowls. He said 2 of my dog's bowls were in the 12.
Right.
And he said one we'd lost 3 years ago, the other one had gone more recently. And he went up, he took his 2 dogs' bowls up, walked up the top of his driveway and put the other 10 bowls in the street. Sort of called a few neighbours out, and the neighbours were like, shit, we haven't seen that dog bowl for 3 years. So whatever it was had been, and that's what I mean about accidental habituation. People leave stuff out and they take them, but they come and take the food or whatever, but these things weren't just eaten out of the bowl. They were taking the whole bowl down into the bush with them eating the dog food. They're obviously storing the bowls somewhere. We actually, just digressing, and we actually think they prefer the stainless steel bowls. They really like shiny things, because another thing that we've done is, how Australians have wonderful inventions, right? We've brought the world Wi-Fi as an Australian invention, so thank you the rest of the world. That's why you can all be on Wi-Fi. But one of the things we invented here was cask wine. Now, that was great. It was where we could take a whole bottle of wine. Nope, Australians didn't want a bottle of wine to drink. They wanted 5 litres of wine to drink. So we created cask wine. But inside the cask, they've got these beautiful plastic foilized bags, which helps keep the wine fresh. Well, we call them drunks' pillows out here, because when they're empty, you can take them out, you can blow them up, and they make a great little pillow, especially when you're camping. But I'll tell you what, throw one of these down into a bush where a group of Yowies are, mate, they'll play with it for hours, and you can hear them down in there playing with it as well. And the other thing we think they like too is like flashing lights, a small flashing light that will attract them. And we've actually, my mates have used to leave a flashing light on their bumper bar when they used to go down and do their research in Wee Jasper. And there's been quite a few times where they've come back and they've seen the flashing light moving around the bush near them. But the best one they ever had was where, as they actually started walking back down the hill, they got within eyesight of their campsite and they saw the flashing light running across the campsite to in front of the truck where they'd left it on the bumper bar, and it disappeared in front of the truck, but you could still see it flashing. And then when they got down there, it was back sitting on the bumper bar, yet somehow it had mysteriously run across the campsite at breakneck speed, like a distance of about 50 metres. So something had took it and was running with it. And, there was no other campers there, so they knew what it was. But, we think that they do like shiny things. So the stainless steel dog's bowls, the shiny foil bags, we've actually found them down in the bush. You can find, I call them plaything stashes sometimes. You'll be off trail and you'll be 100, 200, 300 metres off trail going through scrub, And you'll get to an area where you're like, oh, right, okay, it looks like this looks pretty good. And then you might find a wine cask bag there. You're thinking, how the hell did that get there? You know, I can understand if it's right beside a trail. I find lots of rubbish beside trails because people are pigs, basically, and they do, you know, people still dump rubbish in the bush. But when you find a piece of rubbish like that, yeah, all right, it could have blown there in a big storm or whatever. But when it's sort of in an area where you can actually see something's been in there and there's been some activity, you kind of start asking yourself, oh, maybe they do have these little playthings that I call them, you know? But yeah, the people have accidentally habituated them, and literally, if you look at the Blue Mountains in our research area, you've basically got one major ridgeline that goes from one side of the mountains to the other. Original path the explorers took over the mountains, and the major highway follows that. All of the roads that come off that follow the ridges out off that. So, and no one lives in the valleys in the mountains because the valleys is just bush. All live along the top of the ridgeline. So the Yowies live down in the valleys, and they come up and they've got, you know, hundreds of backyards where they can go into and they can see, you know, people have got the odd fruit trees growing, they've got pet food, they've got pets. I mean, you know, I live in Sydney and, you know, I go to my local cafe and there might be one or two missing pet signs up there, and then I go to a cafe in Lura that has a community notice board in it and there's 30 missing cats and missing pet signs up there, you know?
Yeah.
I think there's a very good reason for that. Because the pets are going. You know, people have lost pets up there. They do eat it, and they always up for a quick meal. Go further north in the Blue Mountains, there's a big apple growing region, and we were just up there doing a research weekend last weekend because this is apple picking time of the year. So all the apples are ripe, and we've had more activity over that side of the mountains than you do over the other side because we reckon they migrate over to that side of the mountains, and it's probably a 20